technology. And then I did my PhD at the University of Wollongong in Australia, which is where I'm visiting from because I hung around afterwards and did a postdoc and then a fellowship. I'm still affiliated with the University of Wollongong, though I'm not in an academic position anymore. I now work for a ethics program that does primary ethics in schools. So that's what I'm doing right now, part-time, designing curriculums for kids. So yeah, my plan today is, spoiler alert, I'm not actually going to define agency at all. What I'm going to do, being a philosopher, I'm going to, I hope, point out why agency is interesting. And I think if we had a definition that was clear and that we all agreed with, it would probably not be as philosophically interesting. And we would not be here to talk about it and bring our, bring our perspectives to this discussion. So that's my plan. First of all, so I think, okay, I can talk louder. So I believe my slides have been posted in the Slack. So thank you for that. But they're also available on my website. So I'll just leave these up for the week and I'll post these are just for today. But every morning before we meet, I will post my new slides so that they're available to you. And that's so that you don't have to write stuff down and feel like, my slides, like you have to write everything off the slides. I've also, I think, tried to, yeah, so.
Can you mute your?
It is muted. Yeah, oh, there we go, okay. Maybe it's just when I get close. I've also numbered all the slides. So except for this one, so that you can just write down the number and notes if you want to like look back. Okay, so that's to try and make things easier for you with note taking. So in the first half of this, here's the things I'm going to go over. I'm going to talk about kind of our general understanding of agency and maybe kind of the intuitions we have from about agency, kind of from our way of life and our human practices. Okay. And then I might problematize that a little bit as an approach to agency just in every field and every discipline, because what we are taking from our human practices is not necessarily what we're looking for when we talk about agency in other organisms or in AI or anything like that, okay? So then I'm going to go over kind of some new work in the biogenic approaches to agency, which are more based in biology. And talk about maybe what we want from a definition without giving one. So kind of the things that we expect from a definition of agency. And I think this is important because how we define agency ultimately kind of guides how we theorize about agency. And it also guides how we form definite explanations, right? So the way that we define agency and the way that we talk about it, the stakes are important because our explanations kind of rely on those definitions as well. And that is kind of setting us up for the lecture of tomorrow where I talk about agency and explanation. All right, so our everyday usage of agency. You might think of legal agency. How many of you worked on agency at all? No? Okay, so when you're coming to the winter school on agency, what do you think of agency? You think of the way that we talk about agency in our practices, we think of legal agency, like deciding whether someone can be legally responsible for their actions, maybe. Or if you're coming from more of a philosophical background, you might be thinking of moral agency, whether or not someone can be responsible, morally or ethically responsible for their actions. Okay. Now, these are the kinds of agency that kind of underpin a lot of discussions in free will, whether or not we have free will. So you might have heard the word, agency talked about in that sense, and ethics, of course. Okay. There's also agency in psychology and development, so looking for the psychological mechanisms of agency and when it is that someone is an agent, when they're responsible for their action. This, we think about this in thinking of child development and responsibility. So some of the things that kind of pop out from our discussions of agency in our human practices are things like acting on one's own volition, doing something because you've chosen to do it, right? It's by my will that I've done, this thing or whatever. So acting on one's own. Decision-making capacities, right? So we've evaluated something. That's kind of built oftentimes into agency, that you can do more than one thing. There's more than one option, and you've decided to do something over something else. So decision-making capacities, right? We're capable of deciding to do otherwise. If we didn't have that possibility, we might not think of that as agency. And then being goal-oriented. So this is going to be really kind of central to the rest of what I'm talking about. I'm not going to talk about goals so much because I don't want to take like a position on what a goal is necessarily, but maybe acting with purpose. So the way I tend to put this is purposiveness. There's something that we're doing with our action. It might be aiming at something. So me getting on a plane to come to the winter school to give lectures. I'm acting in a way where I have an intention or a goal of some sort. I'm acting with purpose. I have a plan. There's something I'm trying to do. There's an aim to my actions, maybe more minimally. So getting kind of into the philosophy and psychology of this, like of our kind of human approaches to agency, I want to point out these are kind of the anthropocentric ones. Okay, when we think of, from our human perspective, what agency is, we kind of, a lot of the philosophy has focused on this kind of stuff and the psychology. So phenomenological, the feeling of being in control of our actions. And is that intuitively makes sense? Like when you're acting, you feel like you're in charge of your action, right? Like there's a mindness to it. It's my action that I am undertaking. And there's agency and means, right? You're actively involved in realizing one's ends. You're creating the action. You're the source of the action. Okay? There's some kind of active involvement in what you're doing. And then the ability to set and achieve one's ends. I decided to get on a plane and come to the winter school and be here. Right? That was my choice. I decided that. And that's where we kind of see that decision-making stuff coming out too, right? That was my decision. I did that. So the ability to set my own goals, right? And achieve them myself. Keep going. Okay, so, right, we kind of are seeing something like engaging in purpose-driven action. If we wanted to kind of come up with like maybe a way of thinking about like a short definition or something, right? Okay, so again, anthropocentric approaches, they use human agency as a standard. So when we're thinking about, okay, how do we talk about making decisions, right? Like, well, humans, we have reasoning skills and language capacities and all of these things. We think about human agency and what it feels like for me to be agentive, what it feels like for me to be responsible for my actions and those kinds of things, right? And then the problem is kind of looking at other organisms and systems and saying, oh, okay, well, do they reason, in the way that humans do? Or do they have the same kinds of capacities that underpin human agency? No, well, then they're not agents. So defining all agency using the idea of what agency is for humans becomes a problem. So using human-based definition and criteria to decide whether other life forms or systems are agents. So the same kind of mechanisms, like generally psychological explanations, looking at psychological mechanisms. If we're using those, the psychological mechanisms that we think underpin human agency, to define all agency, that's called anthropocentrism, okay? Because it's human-centric, okay? So a lot of times the explanatory target is these kind of really robust decision-making processes where I'm writing out, a list of pros and cons or mentally doing that. Explanatory target is, or maybe that sense of agency, that mindness of action. And then those, psychological mechanisms become the explanatory, the thing that we're interested in explaining or getting at and understanding better. So, yeah, this is the problem. Reasoning about human agency and agential capacities, okay? And then reasoning about agency of other organisms and systems, where we're looking for the same kind of explanans. We're looking for the same kinds of underlying mechanisms rather than the behaviors, rather than other things. So, oh, well, we find the human capacity we think is responsible for human agency, and then we look at something else and go, oh, okay, well, do apes have that capacity? Do they have that psychological mechanism? And we use that to decide whether or not something's an agent, okay, rather than looking at their behaviors or other things. So we treat the cognitive resources that we use to explain human agency, psychological mechanisms, whatever we think is underpinning those human capacities, and then treat them as the only resources that can explain agency. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to problematize here. So these could be things like representational content, right? Complex behavioral flexibility. And I don't mean that tons of organisms don't have complex behavioral flexibility, right? But it's like, oh, well, humans have this range of things they can do, and maybe this other organism only has this range of things that they can do. So maybe they're not an agent. Okay. How are we doing so far? Are we getting the problems? Huh? No, not really. Okay. I mean, the issues with anthropocentrism. Do we see why that's a problem, maybe? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, so I was trying to think of like a easy example of why we can't like look at one type of system to decide about agency, and then look at the underpinning of that, and then extrapolate to all kinds of agency, why that's a problem. So this kind of goes back to the analytic tradition of philosophy, and that's Quine. And this isn't called an issue with methodological naturalism. Okay, so, but maybe less complicated. If you define a house, okay, you don't say like, what is a house? A definition that says something like, it's a building made of bricks that people live in. Well, you just said it's only places made of bricks that people live in. So that's not the kind of way that we want to like make a definition of what a house is, because that's not what a house is. It can be that, but if we define it like that, then only things made of bricks count as houses. So our definition is problematic. We've smuggled in the underlying like materials into the definition. And then we don't have a good definition because there are lots of houses, of course, that are not made of bricks, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, cool. So that's the problem with defining agency by human mechanisms, by the things that underpin human agency. We're not getting a full definition of agency. We've smuggled in those human resources into the definition. Okay. Okay, so what we don't want to do is demark the explanatory criteria by human resources, by the things that humans do. Okay. So we don't want to do that first and then say that's what agency is, right? What we want to do is start from the phenomena. What is it that we're actually trying to describe? What kind of behaviors? What kinds of things? And then figure out the explanatory resources that we need for individual cases and different kinds of systems. So we might look at something like this. How many of you have seen slime molds before? I know we've got the special lecture, so I wanted to be sure and show slime molds. Okay, so this is a slime mold, which we'll hear a lot about on Wednesday. Is it Wednesday? Yeah. Okay, so I won't talk too much about them. But we see, right, it traversing this maze. And we see something that looks like we might call that, just looking at the phenomena, not coming in, right, with assumptions, right, about what's going on. What we see happening is the slime mold. Whoops. There we go. We'll play it again. Deciding where it's going to allocate its resources, right? It's going back and forth and it's navigating around. It's putting its resources one place, withdrawing them, putting them the other direction, withdrawing them. It's deciding where to invest its energy. We see it doing that. Okay? We don't have to decide anything about the underlying mechanisms yet. We just see that that's what's happening. Okay, we see directed action. It's going towards this because once it gets to this, right, it moves all of its energy there. Okay, because that's some oatmeal. And that's its favorite food, okay? So goal orientation is, we might think that's some kind of rudimentary goal orientation. It is on its way to have a meal, okay? And self-defined goals, this is important. Those goals orient from the system itself. It hasn't been programmed in some way externally to look for food. It's looking for food because that's what it needs based on its own makeup for sustenance. So self-defined goals, we'll come back to that with the biogenic stuff. Same with plants, this is cool. So you have this pea plant throwing up a tendril, right? Doing searching behavior in a circle. Now, as soon as it gets close to this, it moves from a circular path to an elliptical path. So you can see that if you look from above, you can't see it that well there. But as soon as it perceives it, it starts moving elliptically, it starts reaching towards, right, these to climb them. So we see directed action, it's doing something. It's directing its action, it's changing in response to its environment to direct itself toward doing something. Yeah, so we might, be able to say in some ways, like we have directed action, we might have goal orientation, it is trying to climb. Self-defined goals, those goals are not coming from anything other than the system itself, right? And we have a purposeful response to the environment or affordances, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But, as soon as it finds it, it then, changes its behavior, okay? Like with purpose to climb. Okay, so one way of thinking about what minimal agency might be. So the theme of the winter school is minimal cognition and agency. So I kind of took that as, okay, I'll give some definitions of minimal cognition tomorrow. Maybe we want to just think about minimal agency and start there. So the biogenic approach, this was from a paper in 2006 by Pamela Lyon, where she distinguishes between anthropogenic approaches to cognition and anthropogenic approaches to, and biogenic approaches to cognition, where anthropogenic approaches start from that kind of human-centric way of thinking about cognition. Oh, what is it that humans do? Humans are obviously cognitive. We're maybe the paradigm of cognition. And what we need to do is find out whether or not, some of our capacities exist in other creatures. And if they check the same box that humans do, then we can call them cognitive, and that's okay. Now, Pamela rejects all that. Says, well, really, what the study of cognition needs to be doing is coming from biological principles. Instead, we need to be thinking about how cognition functions for us. Okay, so it's not about its makeup. It's not that kind of problematic, smuggling brick into the definition, right? But we need to think more about how we're biologically organized and what cognition is doing for us. That's a better way to start a definition, or a better founding for a definition. So an investigator adopting a biogenic approach assumes that the principles of biological organization and the requirements of survival and reproduction, so we get an evolutionary kind of basis and way of looking at cognition and the function it's playing, present the most productive route to a general understanding of the principles of cognition. So that's kind of the foundation of the biogenic approach. And that's now kind of called basal cognition. So there's a whole burgeoning field, developing field of basal cognition research now. It's very interdisciplinary. So if you hear that term, you can think of that's, that's actually rooted in this biogenic approach, right? Cognition, whatever else it may be in the future, is naturally a biological process and a biological function. Now, I'm not saying this is right. What I'm saying is this is one way of getting an approach, right? Of carving something out that doesn't necessarily smuggle in the underpinnings, saying these kinds of mechanisms are what cognition is. Instead, she's saying, let's look at biological function as a way to kind of carve out the phenomena that we're interested in and then go from there. We need to look at what cognition is doing for us as biological systems. So that gives us a principled way to think of the purposiveness of behavior, because we can, again, link it to evolution, survival and reproduction, okay, and adaptability. So the purposiveness of behavior, we can think about how cognition has functioned to enable us to survive, right, and reproduce and do all of these important biological things, right? So we get purposiveness kind of from that. We have a starting point that isn't necessarily, oh, humans create goals in this way. And so that's what goals are. We then have a broader scope where we can kind of look at any kind of organism, any biological organism, and think about, oh, okay, well, what purpose does this behavior serve for the organism? So we get what's called existential needs. The existential needs of the organism are something we can base purposiveness in instead of thinking like, oh yeah, I made a plan to go do X, and I have this robust linguistic goal, okay? So we still don't have a definition of agency. We have a way of kind of thinking about purposiveness, or an example of a way of thinking about purposiveness that is not founded in a particular human-centric mechanism, or our human-centric way of being and practices and underpinning mechanisms. And again, I'm not going to propose a definition of agency. But I have been collecting for a while different people trying to define agency, or saying what a definition or a theory of agency should do, like what we want out of a definition, and then maybe more broadly a theory of agency. So here are just a collection, an assortment of demands of things that we need to come up with. So in order for a system to be an agent, there must be a distinction between the system and its environment. And that seems pretty fair. We want to be able to locate, what the agent is or where the agency is happening to an individual. Okay, so we want it to in some way specify what the agents or agency is. Right? We want in some way maybe a theory or even a definition to recognize causal responsibility in some way. Why it is that we say something is responsible for its action. And that doesn't mean morally responsible, legally responsible, just that, there's a difference between me climbing a hill and rolling down, and me going up and setting a ball on the top of a hill and it rolling down. We don't think the ball is responsible for its actions, but if I roll down the hill, you do think I'm responsible for my action. So we want a definition or, maybe a theory to explain what that difference is. Why am I responsible, but the ball is not? And let's see. This is a little more technical, but I just wanted to throw it in, and this is coming more from ecological psychology. But I'll finish in time. Do you want me to go over? Okay, so don't worry about the technical aspects of this, okay? When actively exploring the environment, the agent is attracted or repelled by some of its affordances. Like I said, existential needs, okay? There are certain things that are good for me, which is why I'm attracted to, let's say, a plate of delicious food, and repelled by, like, if a bottle of poison, right? I'm gonna go, to one, right? Like, I'm gonna be attracted to that, the thing that helps me survive. And if I see a bottle that's marked poison, I'm gonna give that a wide berth. I don't want anything to do with that. Okay, so I'm attracted or repelled by some of the things in the environment. Now, by some of its affordances, and the ensuing behavior is partly the result of these invitations, meaning it's the result of me having that, like, a sense of my existential needs. I know the one thing is good for me, and I know the other thing is bad for me, and I'm going towards the thing that's good for me or away from the thing that's bad for me. If I see a bear, I'm going to run away from it, right? This points to the importance of the agent-environment relationship. Agency is not exercised in a vacuum. We think of agency as being responsive to the environment. So we look at the slime mold, searching the environment for that oatmeal. And then once it finds the oatmeal, it reacts, right? It's in response to the environment or in relation with the environment. So the environment is included. And some ways of thinking about that might be through, attraction, being repelled. So it's behavior, but it's behavior in an environment that we're interested in. And then, again, this is another one that points to intrinsic norms. And those are those existential needs that are defined by the system itself and come from its biological makeup. Okay. So all of these are kind of from biogenic type approaches. So I'll wrap up here, I think. So just quickly, Pamela's kind of, this is Pamela Lyon, who'll be here in June, July?
End of July.
End of July, for the A-Life conference. Agency minimally is the ability to engage in action to further system-determined goals. That is one of her early definitions of what maybe a minimal approach to agency could be. And then she links that with cognition in this way. Don't worry too much about that, but that's the idea of maybe a biogenic type definition of agency. Does it check all the boxes? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's all that we want from agency. So I do want to problematize that. If you're interested in whether or not other kinds of systems that are not biological can be agents, maybe this works and maybe it doesn't, but getting system determined goals then is a little more complex because they're not coming from that biological makeup. So I have some discussion questions, so you can look at those. I posted the slides and I'll pass it over to Manuel.
Well, hello, everyone. So my name is Manuel. Very briefly, I have a background in computer engineering, then more AI, more recently, I guess, theoretical neuroscience, some cognitive science, and I guess very much recently applied mathematics, some category theory for studies of agency, still unpublished. So my job is going to be hard because, Nick actually gave an absolutely outstanding introduction to all of the problems that come with agency. So I'm not really sure how much I can add. As you will see, there will be common points, but essentially I'm coming from a different perspective where I look more into, how people try to build agents, what it means to, build an agent, also from a technical perspective and from a more, I guess, mathematical, perhaps physical perspective. There will be common points, as I just said. There will be points where, you might see the type of mistakes that Nick was mentioning. And some of them are on purpose for you to think about, which one way you do prefer to think about when you want to consider agents. And some of them will actually be, just disagreements because, we might have different opinions and you should form your opinion. It is fine to have disagreements as long as you know where you're standing. So, okay, let me see. Oh, wrong button. I will try to give you a very, general overview about, how people think about agents and agency in, technical fields such as physics, control engineering, reinforcement learning, robotics, computer science. Some of them, again, might be something you agree with. Some of them might feel a bit, weird, but this is how people think about agents when they talk about agents in this kind of fields. So in physics, most people will tell you that agency doesn't make any sense. What is an agent? I can write down the physical law for a specific thing happening. Nick was mentioning a ball rolling. I do like that example. It will come out in a couple of slides. But, there's nothing like an agent. There's no decision to be made. There's just a physical description of some event happening in our universe. That's it. So I will not go too much into the details of some of these concepts because we could spend months talking about each one of these. But let's say when you consider reductionism as the idea of just, breaking things down into their smaller components, then, where is agency? If it's a biological system, well, it's just made of cells. Where is agency in cells? Well, it's just made of atoms. Where is agency in atoms? Well, it's just made of quarks. Well, it's just made of, and agency disappears. People looking mostly, at the physical construction of our universe, they don't really think about agency. There's no agency happening there. On the other hand, we might want to consider the emergent perspective, which is more the idea that, combining things together creates some processes, creates some functions that doesn't exist at the level of the single components. I don't want to go too much into the details of weak, strong emergence. Do you think that this is real? Do you think this is just a good explanation for something that is too complicated? But it is important to consider that if we take a purely reductionist view, as most physicists do, there's no agency. Oops, wrong button again. Ball rolling, as I was mentioning. We can write down, we look at this from a classical mechanics perspective. This is one of the first examples we study in any course in physics. We just write down Newton's laws for that. Maybe if we want to be fancy, we consider friction and a couple of other things. That's great, but there's no agency there. It's just a ball rolling down. Now, I don't know if you're much into basketball. He's one of my favorite players in the National Basketball Association in the US. When he plays basketball, it's still a ball. It's a ball in the top figure. It's a ball in the bottom figure. It feels different. I can still try and explain, the trajectory of the ball. I can still try to explain the biomechanics of the body of this player. But there's something, about the decision-making, the fact that it throws the ball one side instead of the other, that, I don't know, it just feels a bit different. And that, I don't think, comes out as clearly as it should be from a purely physical perspective. So this paper, for example, makes a distinction between happenings and actions. Something happens versus, some system does something. Again, it's a bit vacuous, but maybe it's something we'll be able to define or consider in the next couple of days. What is this? Well, this is the Lagrangian or the standard model. This is the best explanation we have right now of our universe without considering gravity. Basically, we can simplify it to something like that. 4 lines, that is, kind of a summary of that big figure from before. We have electricity, magnetism, weak and strong forces. We have the, how they basically interact with other particles. We have the Higgs boson and how that actually gives mass to other particles. Only gravity, as I said, is out. Do we want to say that, okay, where is action in there? I mean, it's not in any of these forces. Is action anything that has to do with electromagnetism? Is it something that has to do with how single atoms interact? Not really. So, I mean, do we really want to go as far as to say that action is the only thing that is not in there? So is action gravity? No, really, no. Okay, I don't want you to think that action is gravity, but, I want you to consider that, as a physicist, I mean, okay, I'm not a physicist. A physicist will look into this and will not find action. If you try to explain to a standard physicist what actions are, what you mean by actions, that will just not make much sense. Right, so something that, Nick was also mentioning towards the end of our first part was, the distinction between agent and environment. This is something we'll come back to. Again, but let's say, agents, if they exist, they are entities, they are some kind of systems. And by entities, when I think about entities, I like to think about this definition given by Beale in his PhD thesis. Entities are systems whose parts make the system as a whole and the other parts more probable to be stuck together. So if the probability, say, of the existence of an arm, of my arm, actually automatically makes my existence more probable. If I didn't exist, my arm wouldn't exist. If my arm exists, then it is, more probable. It is, of course, I can't really go the other way around, completely, but it is more probable that if an arm exists in this universe, there's something like me in this universe. Agents, of course, are more than just this, bubbles, soap bubbles, they are entities. I've never seen half a bubble. I mean, it exists for a very tiny fraction of a second when it pops, but it is really hard to find, half a bubble, a third of a bubble. When you find a part of a bubble, then you're probably going to find the entire bubble. Even so, when I look at bubbles and when I look at birds flocking, they do feel a bit different. And it's not just about timing, it's not just about, say, dimension, it's not just about color. There's something that feels a bit more agentive about birds. And again, what is that thing? So there are some exceptions, luckily, in physics. Big name, Carlo Rovelli, quantum loop gravity. Expert who does actually, consider the problem of agency. I will not go too much into detail about this. I'm just saying it does exist. Some people think about this even in physics. What about computer science? Well, in computer science, we try to model agency. That's, I guess, as far as we go. We don't really consider so much the definition. This is a nice example of agent-based model that I found on the internet. There's millions of them. You can find as many as you want. I just like this figure because, well, it gives us a good intuition of where these people, try to draw agents when they actually need them. So this is a model about agriculture. It considers everything from weather to, water conditions, soil conditions, and all. Agency is the thing at the bottom where you see these more human figures. Well, for them, these are agents interacting. What do they mean by agents? Systems that make decisions. My decisions affect other agents. Other agents' decisions affect my, say, my existence. They also consider something called, software agents. And This might sound a bit weird, to be honest, but this is I would say the standard reference for artificial intelligence as a textbook. Russell and Norwich, probably the first edition is from the 60s or 70s. I don't remember exactly. Now it's 5th edition or something. Standard reference again. And for them, a software agent is just something that receives keystrokes and, gives something out. It could be on your screen. It could be, in any other form of output you might consider. So for them, you write down a piece of code. As long as you give some input to this system, say, I don't know, can you write down your age, like a Google form or something, 32, and then this system gives you something out on screen. To them, this is an agent. They call this a software agent. You might say, well, but that's very different from, an animal or all of the beautiful examples that, that Nick brought out, plants, slime molds. But, it is important to consider other perspectives. Something I will come back to in my next lecture, chatbots. I'm not really sure if you've heard about ChatGPT recently. Has anyone heard about ChatGPT? Raise your hand if you, okay. So, you can give an input and you get an output, you get an answer back. That feels at least a bit more agentive, I would say, than, a Google form where I put my age, address, and a couple of other informations. But, is this an agent? I don't know. Okay, reinforcement learning. This is a field, that is at the intersection of psychology, control theory. More recently, it is more or less standing on its own, as an independent field. But, more or less, like, the ideas behind are always the same. Like, in reinforcement learning, we actually don't really explain agency because we just use other terms to try and define agents, and we don't explain what those terms are. So what do I mean by that? Well, agents are systems that are distinct from their environment. Okay, what's an environment? We're just pushing the problem onto now defining what an environment is. Agents are systems with goals. Great. What's a goal? Does a thermostat have a goal? Does it have to be intrinsic, as Nick was mentioning? What is an intrinsic goal? Agents take action. Again, we go back to the previous problem. What's an action? If I look at it from a physical perspective, there are no actions. It's just physics. It's just atoms. It's just particles. So where are actions in there? These people, they do anyway an amazing work. Like, this is stuff from DeepMind on the left and Google AI from the right. They solve incredible problems. They started off, this is really old stuff, but let's say recent achievements, like in 2016, the Atari games. More recently, they started solving incredibly difficult games by just using pixels. So you just give pixels, like, to one of these systems, and this system learns how to solve really complicated problems. Sometimes, more often than not, I guess nowadays, beating humans in a lot of these games. So, are these systems actual agents? When I play a game, I would say, I'm making decisions for the character, trying to solve a problem. I would say I'm an agent when I do that. Are these systems agents because they can beat me on every single game by now? Not really every single game, but, they're getting better and better every single day. I don't know. Again, I leave it out as a question. I will also bring out briefly something about control theory. This is, some of my background, I guess, is also somewhere in there. Control theory, I guess, gets slightly more into the applied side. So, they just want to solve problems. So they don't really care so much about definitions. They don't really care about contradicting definitions. They just want to start solving problems. So in this case, we have things that start mixing up a bit. And I believe this is really interesting because, part of control theory is something called optimal control theory. It's just an extension of classical mechanics from physics. But if you talk to some people from physics, they will tell you there are no actions. And if you talk to some of these people, they tell you, yeah, of course there are actions. I need actions to solve a problem. So in that case, it's the same difference as between, say, a pendulum that is just swinging, and you're trying to stabilize a pendulum on a position where it's not naturally stable. So let's say there is a stable equilibrium at the bottom, an unstable equilibrium at the top. If you try to stabilize a pendulum in some weird position, you can do that. You just need to provide constant input. You just need to spend energy and just leave it there hanging. And for them, this is an action. They don't care so much about, intrinsic goals. For them, it's an action. They treat this as kind of like an agent. That's fine. More often than not, they don't really care about defining agents. They just care about modeling things that actually seem to be making decisions. Is that an agent or not? They are like, well, I can solve this problem. I'll let you decide if it's an agent or not. For say most of the systems, then they make a distinction between, well, the thing that they want to control and the environment. And the environment is usually the thing providing noise, providing disturbances, providing perturbations. So they do make a distinction there. Do they tell you really what it means for a system not to be its environment? No, they just draw a line and they say, well, this is what it is, for this particular problem, and that's about it. If we drill down even more, I was mentioning control theory as people trying to solve problems, sometimes without really asking the right type of questions. I guess robotics is even more of this. So in this case, I just want to build a robot. I want this robot to do something. And then, is that an agent or not? Look, I build this robot. So, are you familiar? Have you ever seen this robot before? A Roomba? You can put it down on the floor, it goes around, it cleans your room. Pretty simple. Funnily enough, one of the founders behind Roomba, Rodney Brooks, is somebody who spent quite a lot of time thinking about, problems related somehow to agency, to intelligence, to representations, to cognition in general. But more recently, I think it's probably happier to just, build robots rather than, solving long-standing debates. And you might say, well, but this is pretty simple. You just put this thing on the ground and it goes around. Well, yeah, it can avoid walls, can avoid maybe some other things like, your dog's poop. That's great, but that doesn't really feel much of an agent. But what about this? This is not CPI. Does that feel more like an agent? I would say if I had to put my money somewhere, this would feel more of an agent than a Roomba does. But again, this is something I will come back to in the next lecture. Right, so where do we stand? This is, again, a point where I will not be giving you any kind of definition, as Nick did for the first part. It's more of a point where, you know, I start raising questions because, well, A, I don't have an answer, and B, it would be nice to hear what your opinions are and what, say, you might think we are missing, what you might think we already have and we should push on more, and what you think instead, you know, might just be the wrong question that we are asking. So in physics, people might think, okay, there's no agents, there's no agency, it's just physical laws. It's just physical laws all the way down. You get to the quantum level and then, you know, that's it. There's no action anywhere. It's just an illusion. It doesn't exist. Then you get to fields, say, like reinforcement learning, control theory, computer science. They talk about agents, but as we've seen, they talk about agents in, you know, very different ways to what we might want to think about when we think about agents. You know, they talk about software agents. Is that enough of an agent? I don't know. They talk about robots. Every robot is an agent. Well, some of them maybe are, some of them are not. I don't know, maybe none of them are. Then we get, you know, to robotics, like, you know, the proper, you know, implementation, physical implementation. And these people are quite happy to say, as I just mentioned, yeah, you know, my robots are agents. Do they have the sort of, you know, goal-orientedness, intrinsicality, the sort of, you know, biogenic requirements that are perhaps needed for agency? Well, no, but these people call them agents anyway, and maybe this is the right definition of agency. I don't know. Or maybe there is something more, like, you know, this was a small dog in the Roomba picture. Maybe there is a difference between the Roomba and the dog. Maybe there is something even beyond this dog that actually is truly the definition, the essence of agency. But, you know, I kind of leave it open, like, you know, I would argue we barely have a name for this. You might say, oh, maybe it's biology. Well, maybe agency is more than life. I don't know. So the take-home message is basically like the summary of the, say, 5 things we looked at: the physics, computer science, reinforcement learning, control theory, and robotics takes. Again, they are, I guess, a bit of an extreme summary of what is going on, but, you know, you might want to ask also other people, for example, you know, robotics is like Izuka Sensei, what he thinks about this. Open questions. Again, you know, they're open because, yeah, we don't have an answer. You know, it would be interesting if you could help us, you know, figure out some of these questions. What are agents? Do they exist, or are they just shortcuts for explaining like the behavior of some systems that is too complicated to write down in equations? Maybe, you know, the Atlas robot that I was mentioning doing the backflip and all. Yeah, we can write down all of these equations about, you know, how these movements are generated, but perhaps there is, you know, an easier way to explain that, and that's it. You know, it's just an easier way, but there's nothing real in that. Maybe it's just an illusion, or maybe it is real. But if it is real, what do we need from a system to call that system an agent? More importantly, you know, all of these people seem to be talking now, you know, also bringing some of the, you know, arguments that Nick brought out. You know, there is disagreement. You know, I presented a few different views, Nick presented a few other ones. In general, there is disagreement. Everyone seems to be talking about agents and agency. But, you know, some people want to say it doesn't exist. Some people want to say it exists, but it's an illusion. Can we find a common ground, or are we just talking about different things? So should we just keep, say, in our backyard and just, you know, play with our own definition of agency without really looking at what other people think? A few questions for you to, you know, think about. And thank you.